July 25, 1945, Washington, D.C. Long after the last advisors had left the Oval Office, Harry S. Truman remained standing by the window, watching the lamps flicker across the quiet White House lawn. The war in Europe had ended barely 2 months earlier, and yet the weight on his shoulders felt heavier than at any moment since taking office. In his hand, a folder marked Top Secret, the latest update from the Manhattan Engineer District. The room smelled of tobacco and warm paper, the kind that clings to long nights of reading what no human should ever have to decide. Lieutenant General Leslie Groves had insisted on delivering the briefing personally earlier that day. The weapon was ready. The test in New Mexico had not only succeeded, it had exceeded every calculation. What had once been theoretical fear was now a practical, waiting reality. Truman placed the folder on the resolute desk. On its first page, in precise military language, was a sentence that seemed to breathe in the dim light. The device demonstrated a yield exceeding initial projections. Strategic deployment will ensure immediate and decisive military effect. He read it again and again. Each repetition felt like a stone sinking into deeper waters. Outside the windows, the Capitol slept, unaware that the future had just shifted under their feet. Truman lit a new cigarette, inhaling slowly. Since returning from the Potsdam Conference, he carried the confident mask of a man who understood everything. But here, alone, amid the glow of desk lamps and distant cicadas, he allowed the truth to surface. He was about to choose not between victory or defeat, but between errors. The Joint Chiefs had already delivered their projections. A land invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, could cost up to 1 million American casualties, perhaps more. Yet the intelligence reports told another story. Japan was exhausted but not broken. Military leaders insisted the bomb might end the war at once. Scientists whispered doubts and dread behind closed laboratory doors. In this room, every path led to tragedy. Thus Truman opened the dossier again. A line from one of the scientific advisors returned to him. "Mr. President, once this weapon is used, the world cannot return to what it was." He closed his eyes, imagining the desert flash, brighter than the sun, devouring the world in silence before any sound could reach the observers. Some wrote they felt, others wrote of fear. A few, shaken, spoke nothing at all. Tonight, the president understood them, because the silence in this room, this quiet, suffocating silence, was no different. And before dawn, he would have to sign an order that history would never forget, and never fully forgive. Before Truman ever saw the word atomic in a presidential briefing, the project that would soon define his legacy had already consumed 3 years, 3 secret cities, and the largest concentration of scientific talent ever assembled under a single military command. The Manhattan Engineer District, innocently named to conceal its true purpose, began as a desperate response to a fear, shared by Roosevelt's closest advisors, that Nazi Germany might be racing toward a nuclear weapon of its own. In late 1941, the fear was more assumption than evidence, but it was enough to ignite a chain of decisions that would reshape the American war effort. By the time Truman took office in April 1945, the project was no longer an experiment. It was an industrial empire scattered across the continent. At Oak Ridge, Tennessee, entire valleys had been swallowed by fenced compounds, where tens of thousands of workers operated machines whose purpose many did not know. The Y-12 electromagnetic plant roared day and night, separating uranium with calatrons so loud they shook the ground. Most employees believed they were helping build a new kind of radar, or perhaps a system to track German submarines. Only a handful understood the truth. Far to the northwest, along the Columbia River, Hanford Engineer Works had transformed a barren stretch of Washington state into the most secret chemical complex in the world. Inside the B reactor, the first full-scale plutonium production reactor ever built, engineers fought physics itself to maintain critical stability. Here, plutonium for the Trinity test and the bomb destined for Nagasaki was born in pools of glowing water. And then there was Los Alamos, perched high in the deserts of New Mexico, a former boys' school converted into a fortress of chalkboards, barracks, and barbed wire. Here, theoretical physicists and military engineers lived in uneasy coexistence. Robert Oppenheimer, thin and restless, served as the unlikely architect of this world, guiding egos as volatile as the intercalculations they performed. By early 1945, the scientific milestones had turned into engineering ones. Questions about chain reactions and neutron lifetimes had been replaced by questions about detonators, compression symmetry, assembly methods. It was no longer will it work, but which design will work first. All of this unfolded while Truman remained outside the circle of knowledge. As vice president for just 82 days, he was never briefed in depth on the Manhattan Project, a fact that would haunt him when Roosevelt died suddenly on April 12 within 24 hours of taking office. Truman found himself in a room with Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who spoke plainly, "Mr. President, you are now in charge of the greatest scientific gamble ever taken, and it has almost succeeded." Truman listened, stunned. The nation was still at war on two fronts. Europe was collapsing. Japan remained defiant, yet here was an entirely new dimension of conflict, invisible, unimaginable, and now fully in his hands. In the months that followed, as he tried to learn everything Roosevelt had kept compartmentalized, the war accelerated. Firebombing raids devastated Tokyo, the Japanese cabinet rejected surrender demands, and intelligence reports warned of mass mobilization on the home islands. A nightmare scenario was unfolding, a last stand that could consume an entire generation. By the time Truman stood alone in the Oval Office late that July night, the Manhattan Project was no longer just a scientific triumph, it was a potential escape from catastrophe or the beginning of another. The context was simple in numbers, impossibly complex in consequence. A weapon that could end the war, a nation unprepared for what ending the war this way might mean, and a president still learning the weight of the chair he had inherited. By late July 1945, Truman faced a landscape of pressure that no president before him had ever encountered. Every advisor, every general, every scientist seemed to speak with urgency but not with unity. What appeared to be a clear strategic choice from the outside was, from Truman's desk, a maze of competing truths. The military leadership was firm. Japan would not surrender without a shock so devastating that it would shatter their will to resist. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu and Honshu, was a logistical monster. War planners projected hundreds of thousands of American casualties, perhaps more than 1 million. Intelligence reports, intercepted through the Nagasaki code-breaking program, showed that Japanese divisions were reinforcing the southern beaches, digging tunnels, stockpiling ammunition, training civilians. Every day that passed made an invasion more costly. General George Marshall, calm but unyielding, laid the maps before the president. "Mr. President, they are preparing to fight for every grain of sand. The bomb may shorten the war by months, perhaps by years." But the scientists painted a different picture. Some, like Edward Teller and Ernest Lawrence, believed in demonstrating the weapon's overwhelming power. Others, including Niels Bohr and members of the Chicago group, warned that using it without prior warning could set a precedent too dangerous for the world to endure. They urged a demonstration in an uninhabited area, a strike meant for symbolism rather than destruction. Those warnings intensified after the Trinity test. Several observers left the desert shaken, unable to reconcile triumph with terror. A petition circulated at the Metallurgical Laboratory in Chicago, signed by dozens of scientists, appealing directly to Truman. "We feel compelled to urge you to consider the moral consequences of such a weapon." But the petition never reached the Oval Office. General Groves intercepted it, believing it would only confuse the president. Even within Truman's immediate circle, disagreement simmered. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, older and introspective, respected the power of the new weapon. He urged the president to consider not only victory, but the long arc of civilization. He spoke of Japan's cultural pride, of the political aftermath, of the moral burden that would follow. Yet others argued that hesitation was itself a danger. The Soviets were moving fast in Eastern Europe. American blood was still being spilled in the Pacific, and Roosevelt had set these wheels in motion long before Truman inherited them. The president's dilemma grew heavier during the Potsdam Conference. There, amid negotiations with Churchill and Stalin, an urgent cable arrived. The test in New Mexico had succeeded. The bomb was not theoretical. It was real waiting. Truman recorded in his diary that the news filled him with a profound sense of responsibility. But those close to him knew the truth. He was stunned. The geopolitical balance had shifted overnight. Stalin's reaction calm, almost indifferent, and settled the president even more. It signaled that the Soviets might grasp the implications before America could act. As Truman returned home, he carried two parallel certainties. The bomb could end the war, and the bomb could begin something far worse. That the conflict inside the White House was not a clash of opinions. It was a quiet collision between strategy, morality, and an untested future. Night after night, Truman revisited the same reports, the same maps, the same projections. Each path led to devastation of a different kind. The only question was which devastation would come first. In the end, the president realized the truth any leader fears. There are decisions where victory and tragedy walk side by side, inseparable, and somewhere inside that contradiction, Truman had to choose. In the final days of July, the conflict surrounding Truman's decision tightened like a vice. The war was reaching its climax, but inside the White House, the president moved through competing currents of information, each one pulling him toward a different understanding of the future. His military advisors insisted time was running out. The naval blockade was strangling Japan, but the Imperial Army showed no signs of surrender. Reports from Okinawa and Iwo Jima revealed a nation willing to fight with a ferocity that defied logic. Entire units fought to the last man. Civilians leaped from cliffs rather than submit to Allied forces. For Truman, each report was a reminder: if this spirit carried on to the Japanese mainland, the cost in human lives, American and Japanese, would be catastrophic. Yet even as these warnings piled up, a new layer of complexity emerged. Intelligence intercepts from Nagi suggested the Japanese leadership was divided. Some factions considered negotiation, but their conditions were unacceptable to Washington. One message, read aloud to Truman, revealed that the emperor himself was searching for a way to end the conflict if his position could be preserved. This nuance unsettled the president. If Japan was closer to collapse than the generals believed, was the bomb necessary, or would its use foreclose diplomatic paths still in motion? At the same time, Truman faced the pressure of geopolitical timing. Stalin had promised to enter the war against Japan by mid. Some advisors argued that waiting would allow the Soviets to gain leverage in Asia. Others feared that delaying would make the bomb appear less decisive, or worse, allow Japan to surrender before its power was demonstrated. Truman understood that once the Soviets crossed into the Pacific theater, the post-war order would become far more complicated. Inside these strategic calculations, another struggle brewed: the human weight of the weapon itself. Eyewitness accounts from the Trinity test haunted the discussions. The flash had been seen from more than 200 miles away. The shockwave had knocked observers off their feet. One soldier described it simply: "I saw the face of the future, and it scared me." Some scientists begged for a demonstration: an island, a desert, an unpopulated coastline, anything to avoid unleashing the device on a city. But military planners warned that if the demonstration failed, or if the Japanese leadership dismissed it as propaganda, the strategic impact would evaporate. Groves, with his blunt certainty, pressed the hardest. "Mr. President, delay will only weaken the blow. A decisive shock is the only language Japan will understand." But in the quiet moments of the night, Truman felt the shadow of a different fear. What if this shock reshaped not just Japan, but the entire world? What if the path he chose set the pattern for every future conflict? What if this decision, made in a room lit by a single desk lamp, defined how humanity understood war for generations? On July 30th, he sent a message to Stimson: "I simply want that weapon used to end the war, save as many American lives as possible. That is all." But even as he wrote it, he knew it wasn't all. He knew the moment the order was signed, he would become linked forever to a new chapter of human history, one written not in ink, but in light and fire. The conflict was no longer external, it was inside him, a battle between the leader he had to be, and the man he had been before the war, and the night when that battle ended was now only a few days away. August 1st, 1945. The summer heat lay heavy over Washington, pressing down on the city like a weight that mirrored the pressure inside the president's mind. Truman had spent days moving between briefings, intelligence updates, and private meetings. Yet for all the noise around him, the decision ahead felt like a silence gathering in the corners of the White House. That morning, a final set of recommendations was placed on his desk. The interim committee, formed months earlier to advise on the bomb's use, had concluded without ambiguity: the weapon should be used as soon as possible, against a military target, without prior warning. The arguments were laid out in cold, mechanical prose, strikingly detached from the human cost behind every word. Truman read the document slowly. Each sentence carried the weight of inevitability. Each paragraph reminded him that while the scientists had built the weapon, and the generals had prepared to deliver it, only he could authorize its use. Later that afternoon, in the cabinet room, the discussions resumed with an intensity that surprised even him. Marshal Stimson, Burns, their voices overlapped, each representing a different vision of what America must do next. They spoke of lives saved, of showing strength, of preventing Soviet expansion, of ending the war before the autumn. Truman listened, absorbing every detail, but something inside him was shifting. The arguments were no longer competing for clarity, they were converging toward a single point. The war had become a nightmare without end. American mothers were still receiving telegrams every week, The public was exhausted, the military was bleeding, and Japan showed no sign of surrendering unconditionally. That evening, he returned to the Oval Office alone, carrying the latest intelligence packet. Among the pages lay a new MAGIC intercept. It revealed that the Japanese High Command continued to debate surrender, but still under conditions unacceptable to the Allies. There were hints of division weaknesses in their political structure, but no indication of capitulation. Truman leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He knew that history would judge whatever he chose, but soldiers in the Pacific did not have the luxury of time. Every day of indecision meant more death, more telegrams, more empty seats at American dinner tables. In his diary that night, he wrote a short, stark entry. I have made up my mind that the Japanese must face a reign of ruin, unless they surrender. We cannot prolong this slaughter. Those closest to him would later say that this was the moment, the pivot point. When Truman crossed the threshold between doubt and decision, he was no longer asking whether the bomb should be used, but how it should be used. The next morning, August 2nd, he met again with Stimson. The Secretary of War quietly placed a draft of the final operational order on Truman's desk. The target list was already approved. Hiroshima was at the top. Stimson paused before speaking. His voice carried the gravity of a man who had watched nations rise and fall. Mr. President, this will be remembered long after the war is over. Truman nodded. He knew outside. The first light of dawn touched the White House roof. The city stirred awake, unaware that inside the Oval Office, the president was preparing to authorize the most consequential act in modern history. There was no triumph in him, no sense of victory, only the recognition that leadership sometimes demanded choices that no one should ever have to make. And now, with pen in hand, he was stepping into the irreversible. August 3, 1945. The corridors of the White House were unusually quiet, as if the building itself sensed the gravity of what was about to occur. Truman moved through the morning briefings with the reserved calm of a man who had made his decision but had not yet spoken it aloud. Every step, every glance, carried the burden of the knowledge he alone possessed. A new kind of war was about to begin. Shortly after noon, General Leslie Groves and Secretary of War Henry Stimson were ushered into the Oval Office. Truman greeted them with a firm nod, but there was no small talk, no easing into the moment. The room felt suspended in a kind of stillness like the seconds before a storm. Stimson produced the final operational document, already reviewed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It outlined the deployment of the 509th Composite Group, stationed on Tinian Island, and confirmed that the first bomb was ready for immediate use. The language was clinical, precise, stripped of any emotion, but the subtext was unmistakable. This was the hinge on which the war and the century would turn. Groves spoke first, his tone steady. Mr. President, everything is in place. The aircraft is prepared. The crew is trained. We can proceed at your command. Truman listened without expression. He knew Groves well enough to recognize the unspoken pride beneath the general's words, the culmination of years of engineering, secrecy, and relentless drive. But pride was the last thing Truman felt. In this moment, he sensed something closer to grief. Stimson stepped forward, placing the document on the desk. This will authorize the release of the weapon as soon as weather permits. Hiroshima remains the primary target. The president lowered his eyes to the page. The room seemed to narrow, the air thickening as he read. His pen lay beside the signature line, simple, ordinary, almost fragile compared to the enormity of the decision it represented. He thought of the maps he had studied, the photographs, the projections of casualties if the war continued. He thought of the soldiers fighting on islands whose names most Americans would never remember. He thought of the civilians in Japan, trapped in a war their leaders refused to end. And he thought of the world that would follow, changed in a way no one could predict. No treaty could control, no nation could ignore. Finally, Truman exhaled a long, steady breath that carried weeks of conflict and doubt. He picked up the pen. This is not for revenge, he said quietly, almost to himself. It's to save lives, to end this war. With a firm stroke, he signed his name. The room remained silent. Groves nodded once, sharply, and gathered the approved document. The operation was now authorized. The order would travel across oceans, through coded channels, to a small island airfield in the Pacific. And from there, the course of history would follow a path no human could reverse. As Stimson and Groves departed, Truman remained seated, the pen still in his hand. Outside the windows, the summer sun was bright, the lawn serene, an almost unsettling contrast to the decision that had just been made. In his diary later that evening, he wrote a single line that revealed the weight he still carried. I have done what I believed necessary. God grant that it is right. For the first time since becoming president, Truman felt the full solitude of leadership in isolation deeper than any night in the Oval Office. Because now, the silence he had signed was no longer his alone. It would soon echo across the world. The order reached the Pacific in the early hours of August 4th, carried through encrypted channels and delivered to a small, heavily guarded command post on Tinian Island. Here, thousands of miles from Washington, the reality of Truman's signature took on metal, fuel, and human form. Tinian was unlike any other place on Earth in 1945. Carved into a network of runways, longer than anything in the United States, the island pulsed like a living machine. Navy Seabees had transformed the coral landscape into the world's largest forward airbase, capable of launching entire bomber squadrons toward Japan. The heat was relentless, the humidity suffocating, and the air carried the constant thrum of engines being tested, repaired, or prepared for flight. At a secured compound known simply as the North Field, the 509th Composite Group operated under conditions of absolute secrecy. Led by Colonel Paul Tibbets, the unit had trained for months on missions whose true purpose most of the crew did not fully understand. They flew unusual patterns, practiced high-altitude approaches, and rehearsed escape maneuvers that felt unlike anything taught in standard bomber doctrine. Inside a climate-controlled hut, guarded day and night by military police, sat a weapon unlike any ever assembled. The bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, was a dense assembly of uranium, wiring, and carefully calculated physics. Technicians worked in shifts, checking firing circuits, inspecting detonators, verifying that every component met the specifications refined over years of invisible labor in secret American cities. The bomb itself did not look like a device capable of changing the world. To those who saw it, it resembled an oversized steel cylinder, dull gray, with fins bolted to the rear. But the men handling it treated it with a respect that bordered on reverence. They understood enough to know that a single mistake could ignite tragedy even before the mission began. Colonel Tibbet, disciplined and unflinching, moved among his crew with the calm authority of a man who accepted the weight placed upon him. He had been chosen for his precision, his resolve, and his ability to compartmentalize. Yet even he felt the atmosphere shift as the days drew closer. Conversations grew shorter. The base seemed to move with a kind of collective breath-holding where their officers monitored storm patterns over Japan. Meteorologists studied wind direction, visibility, and the typical morning fog that clung to the valleys of Honshu. Timing was everything. The bomb had to be dropped under conditions that ensured accuracy, and only daylight would provide the necessary confirmation of the target. On August 5th, as technicians ran the final electrical continuity tests, Tibbets gathered his senior officers inside a small briefing room. Maps of Hiroshima were spread across the table, its industrial center, its military facilities, its rivers and bridges that formed a natural aiming point. Few words were spoken. Each man understood the strategic logic behind the mission, but none could fully grasp what the weapon would do once released. Outside, the island moved with a quiet sense of inevitability. Fuel trucks rolled across the coral roads. Mechanics inspected the Enola Gay, the B-29 selected for the mission. Its engines were tested again and again, each roar echoing across the base like a prelude to history. That evening, just before sunset, the bomb was carefully loaded into the aircraft using a hydraulic lift. The process took hours, watched by armed guards and conducted with an almost ritualistic precision. No one raised their voice. No one made unnecessary conversation. Every movement was deliberate, every bolt, every latch, every check. When the loading was complete, the crew stepped back in silence. The next time the bomb was removed from the aircraft, it would not be in a workshop. It would be in the skies over Japan, falling toward a city that still slept in peace. And Tinian Island, wrapped in humid darkness, waited. The world was now only hours away from crossing a threshold it could never return from. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, Tinian Island was cloaked in darkness. The humid air hung still, broken only by the occasional murmur of engines warming on distant runways. At Northfield, the Enola Gay awaited its crew under floodlights that carved pale reflections across its polished aluminum skin. It was 2:30 a.m. when Colonel Paul Tibbets arrived, dressed in a crisp flight suit, his face set in a calm that belied the magnitude of what he was about to undertake. He moved with deliberate composure, greeting each member of the crew with brief nods. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, only the quiet professionalism of men trained to carry out orders they understood but could not fully comprehend. Inside the operations hut, The final mission briefing unfolded with military precision. Meteorologists delivered updated forecasts. Hiroshima offered clear skies, minimal cloud cover, and steady winds, a rare combination. Navigation officers confirmed the route across the Philippine Sea, through Iwo Jima, and toward the southern coast of Japan. Security officers reminded the crew of strict radio silence, no deviations, no transmissions. As the men studied the maps, a sealed envelope was handed to Tiff. Inside were the final words from Washington: authorization confirmed. The bomb was armed and ready. By 2:45 a.m., the crew made their way to the aircraft. The island's nocturnal chorus crickets, distant machinery, the low hum of generators felt strangely muted. Perhaps it was the tension, or perhaps it was the sense, shared by many on the base, that something unprecedented was unfolding. The Enola Gay stood at the center of it, all a modified B-29 Super. Its bomb bay closed around the weapon that had required the combined labor of more than 130 Americans to create. Its engines, already warming, emitted a deep, rhythmic vibration that seemed to resonate through the ground. Tibbets climbed aboard, took his seat in the cockpit, and ran his hand across the instrument panel. The gauges glowed faintly in the dim cabin light. He had flown countless missions during the war, but never one like this. Behind him, navigator Dutch Van Kirk checked his charts, while bombardier Tom Ferriby reviewed the release procedure. Synchronized and unforgiving. At precisely 2:58 a.m., Tibbets received clearance from the tower. He switched on the interphone. "All right, gentlemen, let's go." The engines roared to full power, sending tremors across the runway. The Enola Gay began to roll, slow at first, then gathering momentum. Its wheels clattered over the coral surface as Tibbets pushed the throttle forward. The weight of the bomb made the aircraft sluggish, demanding absolute concentration. The runway lights streaked past the windows, a blur of white against the black horizon. Seconds stretched as the bomber fought for lift. At last, the nose rose, the wheels left the ground, and the Enola Gay climbed into the night sky, its silver frame reflecting the faint glow of the moon. Below, Tinian Island faded into darkness. Ahead lay thousands of miles of open ocean, and a moment that would fracture history into before and after inside the aircraft. The crew settled into the rhythm of long flight. The engines droned steadily, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the fuselage. No one spoke more than necessary. The weight of the mission pressed against them, a silent presence in the cabin. As they ascended above the clouds, the world below disappeared. The night sky stretched clear and endless, indifferent to the human drama unfolding within a single aircraft moving steadily toward Japan. For now, there was only the hum of engines, and the knowledge that the world would not be the same when they returned. The Enola Gay moved northward through the darkness, its engines beating a steady rhythm across the vast expanse of the Pacific. By the time the first trace of dawn touched the horizon, the bomber was already hours into its journey. Below, the ocean shimmered with faint silver, a calm surface masking the turbulence of the mission unfolding above it. As the aircraft approached Iwo Jima for its scheduled rendezvous, the crew remained silent, focused, each man locked inside his own thoughts. The island appeared as a dark shape rising from the sea, the silhouette of Mount Suribachi still scarred from the brutal battles fought months earlier. Two additional B-29s, the Great Artiste and Necessary Evil, waited in the pale morning light, joining the formation at 7,000 feet. One carried scientific instruments, the other would document the blast from a safe distance. The three aircraft climbed together, ascending through layers of thin clouds as the sun edged higher in the sky. Inside the Enola Gay, the cabin grew brighter, revealing the tension etched into each man's face. Navigator Van Kirk called out course corrections with calm efficiency. Ferriby, the bombardier, checked the bomb release mechanism again, his hand steady but his breathing slow. In the bomb bay, behind a locked panel of metal and wiring, Little Boy sat in a cradle designed to hold its weight with absolute stability. Minutes earlier, a final sequence had been performed, the insertion of the arming plug. The weapon was now live in every sense of the word. The crew understood that from this moment forward, no errors were permissible. As they neared the southern coast of Honshu, the morning haze thinned, revealing Japan below. Villages, rice fields, winding rivers. Details emerged like fragments of a world at peace, unaware of the catastrophe approaching from 31,000 feet. The contrast was jarring. For months, the crew had trained to visualize Japan as a battlefield, yet from this distance it looked like any other country beginning its day. At 7:24 a.m., Van Kirk announced they were on their initial approach to Hiroshima. The city stretched along the delta of the Ota River, its 7 channels glistening in the morning light. Bridges arched over the water. Electric streetcars moved through quiet neighborhoods. Smoke drifted lazily from factory chimneys. To the men looking through the cockpit windows, it appeared almost serene, yet beneath that calm exterior lay a city of strategic importance. Military headquarters, supply depots, industrial centers supporting Japan's war effort. Hiroshima had been spared previous bombings, not by chance, but by design, preserved as a clean target to measure the bomb's full effect. In the cockpit, Tibbets tightened his grip on the control column. "We're going in," he said over the interphone. The aircraft shifted into its attack run. Ferriby moved to the bomb site, adjusting the crosshairs with careful, deliberate motions. The Enola Gay flew steady, straight, vulnerably, its fate dependent on precision. At 8:09 a.m., the final approach began. Below them, the city continued its morning routine. Bicycles on narrow streets, workers heading to factories, children walking toward schools that mirrored those in towns across America. None of them looked upward. The bomb bay doors opened with a hydraulic groan. Air rushed into the compartment. The crew felt the subtle shift in pressure. Ferriby locked onto the aiming point, the T-shaped Oyoi Bridge, a landmark recognizable even from the high altitude. The seconds stretched, each one feeling heavier than the last. Steady, steady. Tibbets held the aircraft level, fighting the urge to breathe too deeply, and then bomb away. A sudden release, a jolt of weightlessness, a metallic object falling silently toward a city that had not yet understood the meaning of its shadow. Tibbets spanked the Enola Gay sharply, executing the escape maneuver they had practiced countless times. Behind them, the bomb descended for 43 seconds, spinning slightly as it fell through the calm morning air. The crew could not yet see Hiroshima, but they felt the momentane invisible tremor passing through the aircraft. That history was now in freefall.
At exactly 8:15 and 17 seconds a.m., Hiroshima remained quiet. The morning sun reflected off the rivers that braided through the city. Streetcars clattered along their tracks. Workers stepped into factories. Soldiers reported for duty at the headquarters of the 2nd General Army. 43 seconds earlier, a dark shape had drifted silently through the sky, too small to draw attention, too unusual to be recognized. At 1,900 feet above the city, that object, Little Boy, completed its final descent. Inside the bomb, a precisely timed electrical pulse triggered conventional explosives that drove a uranium projectile into a matching target. For a fraction of a microsecond, nothing happened. And then, in the heart of that steel casing, physics shifted. A supercritical mass formed. Neutrons raced outward. A chain reaction ignited faster than the human mind could comprehend. At 8:15 and 17 seconds a.m., the world changed. A flash, white, pure, blinding, erupted above Hiroshima. It was so bright that observers miles away described it as an explosion of the sun. The sky lit up with a radiance that cut through the morning haze and cast shadows sharper than any daylight. In that instant, temperatures at the center of the blast soared to over 1,000,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. Air expanded with violent speed. Matter vaporized. The world for 1 square mile ceased to exist in the space of a heartbeat. A spherical fireball burst outward, growing at unimaginable velocity. Buildings disintegrated. Steel twisted like paper. People within hundreds of meters were erased instantly, leaving only silhouettes burned into stone. Then came the shockwave. It struck the city with a force equal to 1,000 thunderstorms, flattening wooden houses, shattering windows miles away, lifting streetcars from their tracks. The sound, delayed, rolling, thunderous, reached survivors seconds after the light, sweeping through the landscape in a roar that felt both distant and deafening. Inside the Enola Gay, the crew felt the blast as a sudden, violent jolt. The aircraft shook, rising abruptly as the shockwave struck its tail. Then another wave hit, less severe, but unmistakable. The men turned toward the windows. What they saw defied every expectation. A column of fire and debris rose from the city, expanding upward in swirling reds, blacks, and whites. At first, it appeared chaotic, a storm of destruction climbing into the sky. But then it organized itself into a shape the world would come to recognize instantly. A towering mushroom cloud, boiling, folding, reaching miles into the air. Even from 10 miles away, the sight was overwhelming. Captain Robert Lewis, the co-pilot, stared in silence before whispering words. He later wrote in his logbook, "My God, what have we done?" Below, Hiroshima had become a landscape of flame and ruin. Entire districts burned in a single rising inferno, fires merging into a massive updraft that pulled smoke and debris into the sky. The rivers filled with shock-stunned survivors seeking relief from burns they could not understand. Roads vanished under collapsed buildings. Silence gave way to a chorus of distant cries. The Enola Gay circled to observe, maintaining distance, its crew staring through the windows at the unimaginable. They had trained for this mission, calculated it, repeated the procedures until they were muscle memory. But no amount of discipline could prepare them for the sight of an entire city consumed in moments. For the first time, the crew understood the true weight of the weapon now moving silently through the world's consciousness. And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a quiet office in Washington, Harry Truman had already stepped into a meeting, unaware that the event he had authorized only days earlier had just rewritten human history. At 7:30 p.m. Washington time, nearly an hour after Hiroshima had been consumed by fire, an encrypted message arrived at the War Department. The wording was concise, almost sterile, a military dispatch stripped of emotion. Results clear and successful. That was all. No details. No description of the fireball or the shockwave. No mention of the cloud rising miles into the sky. Just confirmation that the most powerful weapon ever created had worked as intended. The telegram was rushed to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who read it with a grave nod before sending a copy to the White House. The president was in the middle of a meeting with his senior advisors when a messenger entered the room. Truman paused, accepted the sealed envelope, and opened it with deliberate calm. He read the message once, then again. His face remained composed, but those present noticed the subtle shift, the tightening of his jaw, the stillness of his hands. He looked up. "It seems to have been a success," he said quietly. The room held its breath. For weeks they had waited for this moment. Yet now that it had arrived, no one cheered. No one smiled. The silence was heavy, almost reverent. Truman excused himself and walked to his private study. The carpet muffled his footsteps. Behind the closed door, he stood alone for several minutes, absorbing the reality of what had just occurred. He thought of the order he had signed. He thought of the men flying the mission. He thought of the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, who had just died. He understood that future generations would judge him not by the war he inherited, but by the decision he had just made. At 11 a.m. the following morning, the White House released a public statement. Truman stood before reporters, his voice steady but somber, delivering words that had been drafted long before the bomb was dropped. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. He emphasized the military significance of the target, avoiding details of civilian casualties, details he did not yet know, and perhaps did not want to imagine. The press room was silent. The reporters understood the scale of what they were hearing, even if the full implications were still beyond comprehension. Stalin received the news in the Kremlin with a rare, unreadable expression. Churchill, now out of office, felt a mixture of triumph and dread. Across the world, governments scrambled to understand what this meant for the future of warfare. But in the United States, reactions varied sharply. Military leaders celebrated a strategic breakthrough. Scientists at Los Alamos felt a mix of pride and unease. Families of soldiers overseas allowed themselves a fleeting hope that the war might soon end. And in Washington, Truman returned to his desk, feeling the weight settle deeper into his chest. The success of the bomb did not bring relief. Instead, it brought an unsettling awareness. The war was not yet over, and the world was already entering a new and dangerous chapter. Late that night, after the reporters had gone and the corridors of the White House were empty, Truman sat alone in the dim light of his study. The clock ticked softly. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Reports about Okinawa, casualty projections, intelligence on Japan's remaining defenses. He folded the telegram confirming the bomb's success and placed it gently inside a folder marked Manhattan Engineer District. For a long moment he stared at it, motionless. The silence in the room felt familiar, heavy, inevitable. It was the same silence he had felt before signing the order, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Tokyo first received reports from Hiroshima that sounded impossible. Communications officers at the Imperial General Headquarters noted that the city had gone silent, telegraph lines down, radio transmissions cut, no contact with local commands. At first, they assumed a major air raid had struck. The Americans had bombed Japanese cities for months. The idea of another attack did not immediately raise alarm. But then came the details, fragmented, confused, almost incoherent. A pilot flying a reconnaissance mission near Hiroshima reported seeing a massive column of smoke rising tens of thousands of feet into the air. Army officers stationed miles outside the city described an extraordinary flash and an expanding cloud unlike anything in conventional warfare. One survivor, struggling to speak through burns and shock, managed only a single phrase that reached Tokyo through military channels. The city is gone. Inside the Imperial Palace complex, the Supreme War Council gathered in haste. The room was tense, the officers exhausted after years of conflict. Yet nothing had prepared them for the first intact intelligence summary delivered shortly before noon. A staff officer read it aloud. A single bomb, considerable destruction. Hiroshima, entirely devastated. Silence swept across the room. Even seasoned generals, men hardened by campaigns in China, the Pacific, and Burma, struggled to understand the scale being described. A single bomb? No air raid? No formation of aircraft? No warning? That afternoon, news arrived that stunned them further. President Truman had announced to the world that the United States possessed a new weapon, one of unprecedented power, capable of destroying entire cities with a single strike. The words reached Tokyo like a blow. Prime Minister Suzuki and Foreign Minister Togo exchanged glances. They had feared something like this since Germany's collapse in May. Intelligence reports from spies in Switzerland had warned that American physicists were pursuing a weapon with extraordinary explosive potential. But the reality still hit with devastating force. In a dim hall inside the Imperial Palace, Emperor Hirohito received a briefing from his senior military advisors. They told him what little they knew. An atomic bomb had been used. Hiroshima's destruction was near total. Tens of thousands were dead. Witnesses later wrote that Hirohito appeared visibly shaken, an uncommon break in his normally reserved demeanor. He asked questions quietly, precisely. Is it truly one bomb? Are there more? No one could answer with certainty. Meanwhile, in the burned remains of Hiroshima, the scale of devastation grew clearer with every passing hour. Survivors wandered through flattened districts, searching for water, shelter, anything familiar. Fires still burned uncontrollably. The injured filled riverbanks and bridges, their clothes burned away, their skin seared by heat beyond comprehension. Doctors in the surviving hospitals, few and overwhelmed, reported symptoms they had never seen. Skin peeling from flesh, hair falling out in clumps, bleeding without wounds. These reports, passed upward through military channels, painted an increasingly grim picture. By the evening of August 6th, the Japanese government faced an agonizing realization. The United States possessed a weapon capable of annihilating any city in their homeland, and potentially many more. Yet even with this knowledge, the war did not end that night. The Supreme War Council remained deadlocked. The army insisted on continuing the fight, preparing for the final homeland defense. Senior generals believed the Americans would not have more than one or two of these weapons. If Japan held firm, they argued, the enemy might accept negotiations preserving the emperor's authority. Others, particularly Foreign Minister Togo, warned that the situation was now catastrophic. The empire stood on the edge of destruction. The bomb was not merely a weapon, it was a signal that time had run out. As the debate raged, no decision was reached. The government remained divided. The emperor remained uncertain. And Truman, half a world away, waited for Japan to surrender. But Japan did not surrender. Not that night. Not the next morning. Which meant a second bomb, already prepared, moved one day closer to its own tragic destination. August 9, 1945. 3 days had passed since Hiroshima vanished beneath a blinding flash of light, yet Tokyo remained frozen in indecision. The Supreme War Council had met twice and adjourned twice, unable to reach consensus, unable to surrender, unable to continue. Japan hovered in a tragic limbo, caught between pride, fear, and the desperate hope that Hiroshima had been an anomaly. In the meantime, on the island of Tinian, another mission was already underway. This time the weapon was Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device far more complex than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. It had been refined after the Trinity test, its design a solution to the limitations of uranium supply. Heavy, spherical, and engineered with uncanny precision, it represented the most advanced understanding of physics reached anywhere on Earth. At 3:47 a.m., a B-29 named Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, lifted from the runway. The aircraft was overloaded, fuel-limited, and carrying a bomb nearly twice as powerful as Little Boy. Even before leaving Tinian airspace, Sweeney faced complications. The fuel pump for an auxiliary tank failed. They were now flying with less fuel than planned, and there would be no time to replace the bomb or delay the mission. The crew pressed on. Their primary target was the city of Kokura, an industrial center housing one of Japan's largest weapons factories. But when Boxcar arrived over Kokura shortly after 9:30 a.m., the city was smothered under thick clouds and smoke from a previous air raid. Visibility was too poor for an accurate drop. Sweeney made 3 bombing runs, each one more dangerous than the last, fuel dwindling, Japanese anti-aircraft guns firing blindly into the haze. With time running out, he made a decision. Abandon Kokura and proceed to the secondary target, Nagasaki. Nagasaki that morning was shrouded in broken clouds, its valleys and neighborhoods momentarily hidden from view. At 11:01 a.m., with fuel critically low and the crew on edge, the cloud cover parted just enough to reveal the Urakami Valley below, a densely populated district home to factories, workers' housing, and the largest Catholic community in Japan. The bomb bay doors opened. Fat Man fell. It detonated at 1,650 feet. The explosion was immense, greater in yield than Hiroshima, but its geography altered the shape of destruction. Nagasaki's mountains confined the blast, channeling it through the valley in a devastating horizontal wave. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Steel mills and arms factories were obliterated. 30 seconds after detonation, the fireball expanded into a towering, boiling cloud that dwarfed the surrounding hills. Witnesses miles away saw a flash that turned the morning sky white. The shockwave shattered windows in ships anchored along the coast. Priests at the Urakami Cathedral were thrown to the ground as the building, Japan's oldest Catholic church, collapsed in an instant. Inside Boxcar, the crew felt the second shockwave hit their aircraft. Someone whispered, "It's bigger than the last one." The men stared at the towering column of ash and flame, knowing they were seeing not just destruction, but the unfolding of a new age. Fuel nearly spent, Sweeney turned toward Okinawa, hoping to make an emergency landing. The engine sputtered as the bomber approached the runway. When Boxcar touched down, it had barely enough fuel left for a single pass. Back in Tokyo, news of the second bomb arrived as a shock that pierced through the government's paralysis. 2 atomic attacks in 3 days. 2 cities erased. And still, the Americans might have more. Even the most hardened military leaders felt the shift. Japan was no longer fighting to avoid defeat. It was fighting to avoid annihilation. That afternoon, Emperor Hirohito took an unprecedented step. Breaking centuries of political distance, he addressed the Supreme War Council directly. His message was calm, gentle, but unmistakably final. We must endure the unendurable. The debate was no longer about pride or strategy. It was about survival. Nagasaki had made the decision unavoidable. August 10, 1945. In the Imperial Palace, the air was thick with exhaustion. For months, Japan had endured firebombing, naval blockades, starvation, and strategic collapse. Now 2 atomic cities lay in ruins. The War Cabinet gathered once more in a room lined with maps of a nation unraveling. No one could deny it any longer. The empire was facing extinction. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo spoke first. His voice trembled despite his effort to maintain composure. We cannot withstand another atomic attack. We must accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. Across the table, General Anami, the Minister of War, sat rigid. His pride remained unbroken, but even he understood the storm closing in around them. The army still possessed divisions, aircraft, fortifications, but none of it mattered now. No force could fight a weapon that arrived without warning, without compassion, without possibility of resistance. Yet he hesitated. Surrender meant the end of everything the military had built. Decades of ideology, sacrifice, and identity. If we surrender unconditionally, what becomes of the emperor? He asked. That question hung in the air like smoke. For many in Japan, the emperor was not merely a sovereign. He was a symbol of the nation's soul. To lose him would be to lose the meaning of Japan itself. Togo replied softly, "If we do not surrender, there may be no nation left to preserve." Still, the council remained split. 2 for surrender, 2 for continuing the war, 2 undecided. Deadlock. The war, on paper, continued. Outside the palace walls, Japan's cities lay in ashes. Hiroshima was a smoldering wound. Nagasaki burned through the night. Hospitals overflowed with victims suffering from injuries no doctor understood. Silent burns caused by radiation. Fevers that rose without limit, bleeding from nowhere. These reports filtered back to Tokyo, each one reinforcing the same truth. Japan could not endure another attack. But the generals refused to yield. Then, something unprecedented occurred. In the early hours of August 14th, Emperor Hirohito summoned his ministers and the Supreme War Council to a special meeting, the first time in history he had stepped directly into such a debate. He entered quietly, almost ghost-like, his presence alone enough to end the arguments around the table. He spoke in a soft, subdued voice, but every word carried the weight of centuries. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. If we continue, the result will be the obliteration of the Japanese people. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The room fell silent. Hirohito continued, "I ask that you accept the Potsdam terms." There were no counterarguments now. Only bowed heads, trembling hands, and the quiet acceptance of a new reality. Japan would surrender. But even then, the decision was not secure. Hardline officers attempted a coup, hoping to seize the palace, destroy the emperor's recorded surrender message, and continue the war. The night was tense. Soldiers roaming the halls, shots fired in confusion, a nation teetering on the edge of civil collapse. In the end, the coup failed. Loyal guards protected the emperor's recording. And before dawn, Japan's fate was sealed. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio in a trembling, formal voice, the first time his people had ever heard him speak. "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace. We shall endure the unendurable and bear the unbearable." Across Japan, people fell to their knees. Some wept. Others sat in stunned silence. The war was over. And around the world, leaders waited for the one man whose decision had set this final sequence of events in motion, President Harry Truman, to respond. But even in victory, Truman felt the weight of what had happened. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, a world forced into a new reality. Peace had come, but the cost of it would follow humanity forever. When Japan's surrender was confirmed on August 15, 1945, crowds surged into the streets of New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and towns across the United States. Sailors kissed strangers. Church bells rang. Factories halted their machines as workers embraced. After nearly 4 years of sacrifice, anxiety, and loss, America allowed itself a moment of unrestrained relief. But in the Oval Office, President Harry Truman did not celebrate. He delivered brief remarks, measured, formal, unmistakably sober. Victory in the Pacific had come sooner than anyone expected, but the method of that victory weighed heavily on him. After the statement, he returned to his office, closed the door, and sat in silence. For the first time since taking office, the war was over. And yet, Truman felt no triumph. He knew what the public did not yet fully understand. The world had crossed into a new and terrifying era. Power had taken on a new meaning, one capable not merely of defeating armies, but of obliterating cities in seconds. The bomb had ended the war, but it had also created a weapon that could end civilization. Reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to reach Washington in greater detail. Photographs arrived, grainy, haunting images of flattened neighborhoods, shattered steel, burned landscapes, and survivors wandering through ruins with wounds that defied medical explanation. Doctors described symptoms never seen in any war. Hair falling in clumps, skin darkening and peeling, fevers rising uncontrollably, internal systems collapsing from invisible injuries. Truman read these reports one by one, and each time, he closed the folder and stared at the wall, his expression unreadable. Aides noticed that he spoke less in those days. He avoided personal comment. When asked privately if he regretted the decision, he did not answer directly. Instead, he repeated a phrase that reflected not confidence, but resolve. "I made the only decision I could." Behind closed doors, Truman wrestled with a deeper question, one he never voiced publicly. Had the world forced his hand, or had he opened a door humanity was not meant to touch? Foreign governments understood the implications more quickly than civilians. In London, Churchill wrote that the bomb had put an end to all illusions. In Moscow, Stalin ordered accelerated efforts to develop a Soviet device. Intelligence agencies in every major nation began drafting reports on a future where wars might be fought not with fleets, but with flashes of light. The age of nuclear diplomacy had begun before surrender documents were even signed. Truman sensed that the strategic balance of the world had shifted permanently. Victory no longer meant dominance. It meant responsibility. Power no longer meant superiority. It meant restraint. In the president's view, the atomic bomb was not a triumph of American might, but a burden the nation would carry for generations. His staff expected him to make speeches celebrating the new weapon, its power, its ingenuity, its role in ending the war. But Truman refused. He did not tour factories. He did not praise the weapon publicly. He did not call it a symbol of American greatness. He called it, instead, a terrible responsibility. As autumn approached, Truman retreated further from the public conversation about the bomb. He rarely answered questions about it. He never described the decision as easy. He did not speak of it as destiny or divine will. Instead, he adopted a quiet stillness that those around him came to recognize as the president's private burden. A silence settled around him, heavy, deliberate, and resolute, because Truman understood something the rest of the world was only beginning to grasp. The bomb was no longer a weapon of war. It was a shadow stretching over the future, and for the rest of his life he would carry the knowledge that he had been the first, and hoped he would be the last leader to use it. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, the world entered a new state of consciousness. A mixture of awe, fear, relief, and uncertainty that no previous generation had ever experienced. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just events. They were thresholds. Humanity had crossed into an era defined not by the scale of armies or the strength of empires, but by the sheer destructive potential of a single device. The initial global reaction was fragmented. In Europe, still reeling from years of devastation, newspapers described the bomb as both salvation and omen. London had survived the Blitz, Paris had endured occupation, and Berlin lay in ruins. Across these cities, people whispered the same question: what happens the next time a war begins? In Moscow, Joseph Stalin received intelligence reports with cold precision. He feigned indifference during meetings, but inside the Kremlin, urgency surged. Soviet physicists were ordered to accelerate their research. Laboratories expanded overnight. Materials were requisitioned. The race for nuclear parity had begun quietly relentlessly. Meanwhile, in capitals across Asia and the Middle East, leaders contemplated the implications with growing apprehension. The old world order, built on diplomacy, borders, and armies, had fractured. A single nation now held a weapon capable of reshaping global power instantly. Allies looked to Washington with hope. Rivals watched with suspicion. The bomb, in its terrifying simplicity, had redrawn the balance of the world. In the United States, public opinion settled into an uneasy mixture of triumph and disbelief. Many Americans believed the bomb had saved untold lives by ending the war quickly. Others, especially after photographs of Hiroshima emerged, began to question the price of such victory. Churches debated the ethics of atomic warfare. Universities held public forums. Newspapers printed editorials trying to articulate what the world had witnessed. Yet beneath the public conversation, another reality unfolded, one that would define the decades to come. Nuclear strategy. The Pentagon, now fully aware of the bomb's implications, began drafting the first doctrines of deterrence. How many weapons were needed? How fast could they be delivered? What defenses could be built? And most troubling of all, what would happen if another nation acquired the same technology? Scientists who had once celebrated the success of the Manhattan Project found themselves at odds with the military's growing ambitions. Some argued for strict international control. Others warned that secrecy would only fuel a global arms race. In October 1945, Oppenheimer met with Truman in the White House. Deeply shaken by the destruction he had helped unleash, Oppenheimer told the president, "I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman reacted sharply, more defensive than angry. "The blood is on my hands," he replied. He later instructed the staff not to bring Oppenheimer to him again. The meeting revealed a profound divide. For scientists, the bomb was a moral dilemma. For military strategists, it was a weapon to be understood. For Truman, it was a responsibility he could not escape. Meanwhile, in Japan, the consequences deepened. Radiation sickness, unknown, invisible, relentless, spread among survivors. Hospitals overflowed. Families searched for loved ones in the ruins. For many, the war did not end with surrender. It lingered in the slow, painful toll of injuries that did not heal. International observers documented the devastation. Their reports circulated quietly among diplomats and leaders. The images of charred foundations, burned-out trams, collapsed schools, and shadows etched onto concrete walls became symbols not only of war's brutality, but of the new reality humanity faced. Technology had surpassed morality. The world after Hiroshima was a world without illusions. And as the months passed, leaders realized that the next conflict, if it ever came, would not be fought with trenches or fleets. It would be fought with decisions made in quiet rooms by men who might never see the consequences firsthand. The atomic age had begun, and history, like the horizon after a storm, looked unfamiliar and unpredictable. But one more chapter remained to be written, the story of how Truman lived with his decision, and how that silence shaped the memory of the century. In the years after the war, Harry S. Truman carried the burden of his decision with a quiet, unwavering gravity. He rarely spoke publicly about the bombings, and when he did, his words were measured, almost austere. He insisted that the choice had saved lives, shortened the war, and prevented an invasion that might have shattered an entire generation. He believed he had done what was necessary, but those who knew him sensed a deeper truth. Truman never fully escaped the silence that followed the flash. As the world entered the Cold War, the president watched the consequences of his decision ripple outward. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, shattering America's brief nuclear monopoly. New weapons appeared: hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear devices capable of erasing entire nations. Concepts like mutually assured destruction entered the language of strategy. The world had become a delicate balance of fear. Truman often found himself at the center of this evolving storm. And yet, privately, he sought a simpler life. Walking the streets of Independence, Missouri, without security escorts, visiting neighbors, sitting on his porch in the evenings. He appeared calm, grounded, almost ordinary. But in moments of rare introspection, he hinted at the weight he still carried. He once told a friend, "I knew what I was doing when I stopped the war. I didn't know how the world would live with it." Historians would debate his decision for decades. Some would argue that he saved millions of lives. Others would insist the war could have ended without atomic force. Some pointed to geopolitical motives, signaling power to Stalin. Others emphasized the sheer exhaustion of a world desperate to end its suffering. But Truman himself never offered new explanations. He believed that defending the decision endlessly would only deepen the divide it had created. Instead, he chose restraint, an acknowledgement that some choices in history resist simple justification. As the years passed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of loss, of warning, of the fragile boundary between war and annihilation. Survivors shared their stories. Memorials rose from the ashes. And every world leader who visited those cities confronted the same question Truman had faced alone in 1945. If placed in the same moment with the same information, what would you have done? It is a question without an easy answer. Truman died in 1972, long before the archives opened, long before scholars revealed the full complexity of Japan's internal struggle, or the debates inside the Manhattan Project, or the intelligence reports that shaped his decisions. He did not live to see the later generations who judged him harshly, or those who defended him fiercely. He did not witness how new nations joined the nuclear club, or how close the world came, more than once, to disaster. But he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that his decision had divided the century into before and after. The night he signed the order remained with him, unspoken, a silent companion to his legacy. The pen stroke that ended the war also opened a door that humanity has never fully closed. In the end, Truman remains a man suspended between necessity and consequence, neither hero nor villain, but something far more human, a leader forced to choose in a moment when every choice led to tragedy. And the silence he carried became a reminder to the generations that followed. That power without reflection is peril, that progress without restraint is danger, and that the future of the world can hinge on a single decision made in the quiet of a dimly lit room. The decision that divided a century.